This is the third and final lecture on slavery and the founding. In the first lecture, we saw that the founders did indeed recognize that the principle of natural equality, which they asserted, contradicted the institution of slavery. And we saw that they took actions to limit and to abolish it. In the second lecture, we looked at the Constitution's compromises with the institution of slavery. And really, the upshot there is that slavery already existed, and the Constitution extended to slavery pretty minimal protections that were necessary in order to ensure that the Southern states would be part of the Union. And they thought the Union was necessary for the preservation of the liberty of all. So they were limited concessions, and we also saw that the founders really believed that the institution of slavery can and should have an expiration date. They didn't really envision slavery as a permanent part of the Union. But as we know from history, it turned out that the slavery issue was much more complicated, that slavery did not go away, that in fact it spread and grew stronger and eventually tore the country apart in the Civil War. So, why did abolition fall short? Why wasn't there a process towards the gradual emancipation of the slaves? And West gives four main reasons, which I want to go through now. And some of these are more controversial than others because, again, West is not merely trying to explain the founders, but trying to defend their approach. And I think there's definitely room to disagree with him here, but these are good arguments nonetheless. Now, reason one why the abolition falls short is just selfishness, right? On the one hand, you have the principle of equality. On the other hand, you have many people with a very strong economic interest in sustaining the institution of slavery. And human beings are imperfect. And many had a strong interest in the preservation of slavery. They sometimes even acknowledged this. So part of the reason why it was just economic self-interest. And this especially becomes the case in the early 1800s when you have the invention of the cotton gin, which made slavery much more profitable. One of the beliefs, one of the reasons why a number of people thought that slavery would phase out over time is they thought that slave labor was much less productive than free labor. So they thought that in effect slavery would be outcompeted over time, and that, as we would say, market forces alone would suffice to lead to the abolition of slavery. But that turned out not to be the case, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, when slavery became, unfortunately, very economically, just in terms of dollars and cents, became economically efficient. So selfishness, that's obstacle one. The second thing, and here West is very straightforward in laying out their thinking, is that many of the founders thought that the immediate abolition of slavery would have been unjust. This is what Jefferson talks about with slavery. We have the wolf by the ears. It's dangerous to hold on, and it's dangerous to let go. Right? It's dangerous to sustain slavery, and it's dangerous to try to abolish it. One of the reasons why is because there was fear, and this fear extended into the 1800s. There was fear that a quick abolition of slavery could lead to race war, given the fact that whites were prejudiced. And that African Americans, ex-slaves, would have borne very heavy grievances against their former masters. So they didn't think that it would be possible to just forgive and forget slavery. And so a quick abolition would just be setting the stage for a race war. And something like that did happen during the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s. So these fears were not simply paranoid delusions. Race-based animosity did exist and become destructive. And there had been some racial violence and strife. So this wasn't a completely unfounded fear. And so only to the extent that immediate abolition could lead to injustice does it become thinkable that we should be gradually abolishing. Now, what I mean by that is you have to raise the question, which situation ultimately would be more unjust? Immediate abolition with the attendant social conflicts and possibilities of race war, or a more peaceful but more gradual abolition that would require people to stay in slavery longer, but thereby would sort of make it easier for abolition to happen slowly without being socially disruptive. So the thinking was it is more just to abolish gradually than to abolish immediately, because immediate abolition would be more destructive, would actually ultimately cause more harm than gradual abolition. And so they thought the gradual approach would be better because it could be done more peacefully and more orderly. So that's the second claim. Gradual abolition is more just because less socially destructive. The third claim is the most controversial one. When this was that many whites, most whites at the time of the founding, did not believe that former slaves would possess the qualities necessary for citizenship. West talks about this on pages 25 through 28. Most white Americans prior to the Civil War opposed the political equality of African Americans, even when they thought that slavery was unjust. They didn't support political and social equality. Um, Now, part of this, you had a lot of support among founders for a policy of emancipation and colonization. As you see this with Madison, you see this later on with Lincoln. So the idea would be, African Americans have the right to be free, but they thought that doesn't necessarily mean that they are entitled to be citizens of the United States. And that's why Madison and others supported colonization. The idea being that in effect, that freed slaves would not be able in a peaceful and orderly way to be equal citizens with whites, and so therefore they should have their own political community. Um, and like I said, even Lincoln supported this, right, in the 1850s, this approach that they should be emancipated but have their own political community, they not have a mixed race political community. Um, and since the founders believed that good citizenship and liberty required certain virtues from citizens, and since it was believed that slaves lacked most of those virtues, and not because of natural inferiority, but because of their condition, right? That when you're raised in slavery, you're not taught the habits of free living. This was the thinking. So they thought that granting slaves equality would have been harmful to the political community as a whole, because it would have led to the influx of a number of people that were not capable of being responsible citizens. Now, again, there are mixed opinions here, because obviously racial prejudice meant that lots of Americans thought that African Americans would never possess the same level of virtue as whites. And that's just the racism that has been present in American society from almost the beginning. But then you had others such as Jefferson, for example, who believed, well, this is not necessarily because of natural differences ultimately, but simply because of the effects of having been raised in slavery. Now, of course, I would say even that could be questioned, whether that's actually correct or not, but that was their belief. And so this is why oftentimes when slaves were freed in a number of states, even when slaves were freed, they weren't granted citizen rights. They actually lived more like resident aliens. They didn't have the right to vote and things like that. And West, on pages 26 through 27, doesn't really explain why. And I think to a certain extent, he downplays the influence of racism on the how the founders approached and the early generations of Americans approached the institution of slavery. But so the argument here was that we cannot really abolish slavery on a large scale until we have a place that freed slaves can go to in order to form their own community separate from white Americans. The most controversial thing that West argues is that it's actually consistent for people who believe in natural equality also to be in favor of colonization. And this is based on this claim that just because you have the natural right to liberty doesn't mean you have the right to be a citizen of a particular country without getting the consent of those who are already citizens, right? The idea being that a self-governing community gets to determine for itself who is allowed to become a citizen and under what conditions. And as West says on page 30, justice required no more than to give them, that is, the freed slaves, back their native liberty with appropriate aid until such time as they could live on their own, in their own country. That's his argument. I think that's highly questionable. Uh, on the one hand, it does make sense to say that this is what a lot of the anti-slavery founders believed, but whether or not it's actually correct is a different question, because of course it discounts the extent to which the slaves are already invested in this country. It discounts the fact that they've already been taken away from, or their ancestors were taken away from, their own homes. So then to just kick them out of the only country that they know or that they've been a part of, to kick them out of a country that they've worked to build, I think there's an argument to be made that that is profoundly unjust. So I don't follow West in his belief that the founders were justified to approach things this way, but I think he's right that that's how they approached things. Right? So why wasn't slavery abolished? One, out of selfishness. Two, out of the belief that immediate abolition would have unjust consequences, and therefore abolition should be carried out gradually. Three, because they weren't quite sure how to do it, how to handle freeing the slaves. Right? That's this whole question of where do freed slaves go? Because they did not believe that they could be peacefully integrated into the community, into the American community. And then the last reason why slavery wasn't abolished was out of a kind of misguided optimism. A lot of founders, such as Jefferson, believed that the country would make moral progress over time, and that this would kind of more or less inevitably lead to the abolition of slavery. That obviously proved to be a delusion. Right, the country was torn apart. Instead, there is no automatic process of moral enlightenment that would lead to white Americans accepting not only the emancipation of slaves, but their equal status as citizens. This didn't happen. And so a choice would have to be made. Now, as we'll see in the next classes, around about the 1830s, the South begins to break decisively with some of the founding principles. We're talking about Calhoun and others. Namely, there's an intellectual and moral shift in Southern leadership. And in the early 1800s, you begin to have Southern leaders who start to positively defend the institution of slavery as a good thing. So as opposed to people like Washington and Jefferson, who would say slavery is evil, slavery is bad, slavery should be gotten rid of, but we just can't do it yet. We can't do it correctly yet. And therefore, slavery is a kind of necessary evil for a time. It's bad in itself, but its existence must be tolerated because any hasty move to get rid of it will cause more harm than good. That was the approach. And so Southern leadership in the early 1800s begins to reject the necessary evil argument and instead say, no, there is nothing wrong with race-based slavery. And this is the beginning of what becomes Confederate ideology. It was not the ideology of the founding generation, even in the South, but it becomes so in the early 1800s. And then you also have, which we'll get to, you have people such as Chief Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision, and Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, who begin to promulgate the opinion that, in fact, all men are created equal was never intended to apply to African Americans, that really all men are created equal should be understood to be asserting that all white men are created equal. So you have a kind of an attempt to revise the meaning of the founding, to get rid of the principle of natural equality. These are developments that we will talk about that have come subsequently. And really, as I will argue, Abraham Lincoln reasserts the founders' understanding of this, that yes, all human beings, regardless of race, are equally entitled to liberty. Therefore, slavery is unjust. But we must find a way to abolish slavery that at the same time maintains the union and maintains peace and order within society. And that's really Lincoln's approach. But of course, when he's elected president, the South secedes, and instead of Lincoln's approach being followed, you have the Civil War, which we will also talk about in subsequent lectures.